London, 1837. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering against the thin window like it wanted to break in. Clara Bennett sat alone in her tiny rented room, the single candle flickering wildly. In her hands was an old, yellowed letter, 8 years old. The edges were worn soft from being read too many times. Her father's handwriting, once so neat and careful, now looked like it had been written by a man running out of time. She read the last line again, her throat tight. The Duke of Ravenscourt betrayed us all. Her fingers trembled. 8 years ago her father had died trying to protect this very letter. He had taken the blame for a theft he never committed, all to shield someone more powerful. And that someone was Lucas Hawthorne, the man they called the Shadow Duke, the man who now ruled one of the oldest fortunes in England. Clara closed her eyes. She could still hear her father's last words whispered in a fevered breath. "Never go near him, my girl. He destroys everything he touches." But tonight was different, because tomorrow Ellie would turn 18. And without money, without protection, her bright, dreaming little sister would be forced into a life of endless servitude, just like Clara had been. She looked down at the letter one last time. Then she folded it carefully, slipped it into the pocket of her plain wool cloak, and stood up. "I'm sorry, Papa," she whispered into the empty room. "But I have no choice." The next morning, under a gray sky that still carried the scent of last night's rain, Clara took the long coach ride out of London. Every mile felt heavier. Her hands never stopped clutching the small leather satchel that held the only proof she had left. Faded documents, a few torn ledger pages, and that single damning letter. She was nobody. A bookkeeper's daughter. A woman with calloused hands and no title. And she was walking straight into the lion's den. By late afternoon, the coach finally stopped at the edge of the vast Hawthorne estate. Tall iron gates rose before her, black and forbidding, crowned with the family crest. Beyond them, the great stone manor loomed like a sleeping giant against the darkening sky. Clara's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her ears. She paid the driver, stepped down onto the wet gravel, and walked toward the gates. The wind tugged at her cloak. Rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder, soaking through her clothes. She stopped just outside the gates. For one long moment she almost turned back. What was she doing? A poor girl with nothing but an old letter, daring to accuse a duke. Then she thought of Ellie's laughter, of the way her sister still believed the world could be kind, of the promise she had made at their father's grave. Clara lifted her chin, squared her shoulders, and pulled the bell rope with a steady hand. The deep clang echoed across the grounds. Minutes passed. The rain grew heavier. Then the heavy front doors of the manor opened. A tall figure stepped out onto the stone steps. Even from this distance, she knew it was him. Lucas Hawthorne. He descended the steps slowly, without hurry, as though the rain had no power over him. His dark coat clung to broad shoulders. His face was sharp, aristocratic, and impossibly cold. When he finally stopped on the other side of the iron gates, those dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made the air feel thinner. Clara's breath caught. For 8 long years she had imagined this moment. She had pictured anger, fear, even hatred in her heart. But standing here now, drenched by rain, staring up at the most powerful man in London, she felt something else, something dangerously close to doubt. Lucas Hawthorne's voice cut through the rain, low and rough, carrying the weight of old stone and older secrets. "You rang my bell in the middle of a storm. Miss Bennett?" she answered, her voice steadier than she felt. Clara Bennett. His eyes narrowed slightly, as though the name stirred something buried deep. "And what business does Clara Bennett have at Ravenscourt Manor?" Clara reached into her cloak and pulled out the letter. The rain immediately began to blur the ink, but she held it up so he could see. "I came to return something that belongs to you. Your Grace." She paused, heart-hammering. "Or perhaps something that will destroy you." The wind howled between them. Lucas Hawthorne stared at the letter in her hand. For the briefest moment, so quick she almost missed it, something raw flickered across his face. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. And pain. He stepped closer to the gate rain streaming down his face and spoke again, quieter this time. Then you had better come inside, Miss Bennett. The iron gate slowly creaked open. Clara took one step forward, then another. She was crossing the threshold into the world of the man who had ruined her family, and she had no idea that in doing so, she was about to change both their lives forever. The heavy oak doors of Ravenscourt Manor closed behind Clara with a sound like a final breath. She followed a silent footman down a long corridor lined with portraits of stern ancestors. Their painted eyes seemed to watch her every step. Rain still dripped from the hem of her cloak onto the polished marble floor. The footman stopped before tall double doors and opened them without a word. Clara stepped into the library. It was darker than she had imagined. Heavy velvet curtains blocked most of the dying daylight. Only a few lamps burned low, casting long shadows across rows of ancient books. The air smelled of aged leather smoke and something colder. Loneliness. Lucas Hawthorne stood near the massive fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel. He had changed out of his wet coat, but his dark hair still glistened with rain. When he turned to face her, those intense eyes locked onto hers once more. "Speak, Miss Bennett," he said quietly. His voice was low-controlled, yet carried the weight of thunder held back. "You came all this way. Now say what you came to say." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. Her fingers were cold as she reached into her satchel and pulled out the faded letter and the small bundle of documents. She walked forward and placed them on the low table between them. "This letter was written by my father 8 years ago," she said, her voice steady even though her hands shook. "It accuses you of destroying him, of forcing him to take the blame for money that disappeared from your family's accounts. He died protecting this, because he was terrified of what you would do if the truth came out." Lucas stared at the papers. For a long moment he didn't move. Then he picked up the letter slowly as if it might burn him. His eyes moved across the lines. Clara watched his face carefully. At first there was nothing. Then his jaw tightened. A muscle flickered near his temple. His breathing changed, just slightly, but she noticed. "I did not do this," he said at last. The words came out sharp, almost angry. "Your father was a trusted man. I never accused him of anything. But the money vanished." Clara pressed, stepping closer. "And my father was the one blamed. He lost everything, his reputation, his health, his life, all because someone needed a scapegoat." Lucas looked up. For the first time, something raw flashed in his eyes, something that looked dangerously like pain. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he whispered. Before Clara could answer, the library doors opened again. A tall, elegantly dressed man entered with smooth confidence. His smile was pleasant, almost warm, but his eyes were sharp. "Lucas," he said smoothly, "I heard we had an unexpected guest in this miserable weather." He turned to Clara and gave a small bow. "Victor Langford at your service. Cousin to His Grace." Victor's gaze moved between Clara and the papers on the table. "Am I interrupting something delicate?" he asked, his tone full of gentle concern. Lucas's shoulders stiffened. Clara felt the shift in the air immediately. Victor was playing a part, she could sense it. His words sounded supportive, yet every sentence seemed carefully chosen to plant doubt. "Miss Bennett has brought some old documents," Lucas said tightly. "She believes I wronged her family." Victor raised an eyebrow, then looked at Clara with what appeared to be sympathy. "How terrible," he murmured. "If there is any truth to this, Lucas, you must do the honorable thing. The Hawthorne name cannot afford another scandal." Clara watched Lucas's face. He said nothing, but his knuckles had gone white where he gripped the edge of the table. Later that evening, after a tense and mostly silent dinner, Lucas made a decision that surprised them both. "You will stay," he said quietly as they stood in the dimly lit hallway, "as my temporary bookkeeper. You will examine the old ledgers yourself. If there is proof I destroyed your father, you will find it here." Clara hesitated. Part of her wanted to refuse. Another part, the part that had carried this anger for 8 years, knew this might be her only chance. "I accept," she said softly. That night, Clara was given a modest but clean room in the East Wing. Before she could even unpack, a note arrived from Lucas. Inside was enough money to send Ellie to safety. She wrote quickly to her sister, then arranged for Ellie to stay temporarily with Lady Amelia Worthington, her oldest and most trusted friend. As the house grew quiet around her, Clara sat at the small desk and began going through the first stack of ledgers Lucas had provided. Hour after hour she worked by lamplight. At first everything seemed to confirm what she had always believed. But then, small things began to appear. A number that didn't quite add up the way it should. A signature that looked slightly different from Lucas's usual hand. A margin note in her father's handwriting that spoke of pressure from above rather than naming Lucas directly. Clara rubbed her tired eyes. She reached for another folder and a single loose sheet of paper slipped out. It was her father's handwriting again. But this time the words were different. "Someone else is pulling the strings. I fear I have been made the fool. And the Duke may be as blind as I was." Clara's breath caught. She sat very still, the paper trembling in her hands. All these years she had carried one story in her heart, that Lucas Hawthorne was the villain who ruined her family. Now, for the first time, a crack appeared in that story, and with that crack came something she never expected. A quiet, unwelcome wave of pity for the cold, solitary man who lived alone in this enormous, shadowed house. Clara folded the paper carefully and pressed it to her chest. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Inside, the walls of Ravenscourt Manor seemed to hold their breath, and somewhere down the dark corridor Lucas Hawthorne sat awake in his study, staring into the fire, wondering why the arrival of one determined young woman had suddenly made the silence of 8 long years feel heavier than ever before. The days that followed blurred into long, quiet nights inside Ravenscourt Manor. Clara and Lucas worked side by side in the library, surrounded by towers of old ledgers and yellowed papers. The fire crackled low in the grate, casting a warm but unsteady glow across their faces. At first they spoke only of numbers, columns, dates, signatures. But as the hours stretched deep into the night, something began to shift. One evening, after hours of silence, Lucas set down his pen and looked at her across the wide oak table. "I was barely 20 when my father died," he said suddenly, his voice rough with memory. "The title came crashing down on me like a stone. Everyone expected me to know how to carry it, but I was still just a boy trying not to drown." Clara lifted her eyes slowly. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines of his face, the way his shoulders carried years of invisible weight. "I never wanted any of this," he continued quietly. "The power, the whispers, the constant fear that one wrong move would bring the entire family down." He paused, fingers tracing the edge of an old ledger as if it might burn him. And then, the money disappeared. People looked at me and assumed I had taken it. Or worse, that I had let it happen. Clara felt her chest tighten. She thought of her own father's tired eyes in those final months. "My father died with nothing," she whispered. "We lost our home. I had to leave school. Every night I lay awake wondering how I would feed Ellie, how I would keep her safe when the world seemed so cruel to girls with no name and no fortune." Their eyes met across the table. In that moment the air between them felt heavier, warmer, charged with something neither dared name. Night after night the walls of the library witnessed small, careful truths. A shared cup of tea when the clock struck 2. A quiet nod when one of them found a troubling entry. A hesitant smile that lingered just a second too long. Clara began to notice the way Lucas watched her when he thought she wasn't looking guarded, yet strangely gentle. And Lucas began to see the quiet strength in Clara's steady hands, the way she refused to flinch even when the numbers painted ugly pictures. But shadows were moving elsewhere in the house. Victor Langford moved through the corridors like smoke, smiling politely at the servants, asking innocent questions, planting careful seeds of doubt. One morning, Mrs. Cora Whitaker entered the library with a tight expression. In her hands was a small silver box that had gone missing from the Dowager's private collection. It was found in Miss Bennett's room, the housekeeper said stiffly, avoiding Clara's eyes, along with several notes that suggest unauthorized withdrawals. Clara rose to her feet, stunned. That's impossible. I have never touched anything that doesn't belong to me. Victor appeared in the doorway at that exact moment, his face arranged in perfect concern. These are serious accusations, he said softly. Lucas, for the sake of the family name, perhaps it would be wiser to send Miss Bennett away before this becomes a public embarrassment. Clara's heart pounded with fear and anger. She could feel the walls closing in the same helpless feeling she had known after her father's death. Just as Mrs. Whitaker turned to summon the footman, the library doors opened once more. Colonel Thomas Blackwood stepped inside, his military bearing still sharp despite his graying hair. He carried a worn leather folder under his arm. I came as soon as I received your message, Miss Bennett, he said calmly. And I bring information that may shed light on matters long buried. Before anyone could respond, Lucas stood up. His voice rang clear and commanding through the room. No one is sending Miss Bennett anywhere. Every head turned toward him. Lucas looked directly at Victor, then at Mrs. Whitaker, his gaze steady and unyielding. Miss Bennett is under my protection. These accusations are false until proven otherwise, and I will not allow fear or gossip to drive her from this house. The silence that followed was deafening. Clara stared at him, breathless. In that single moment, Lucas Hawthorne, the cold, distant duke everyone feared, had publicly stood against his own family and his own housekeeper. For her. Something deep inside her chest cracked open. Later that night, when the house had finally grown quiet again, Clara found Lucas standing alone by the tall library window, staring out into the darkness. She approached slowly, her footsteps soft on the rug. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas turned to face her. Rain tapped gently against the glass behind him. He looked tired, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "Because I'm tired of watching innocent people pay for sins they didn't commit," he said. He took one step closer, then stopped as if afraid of his own words. "I am not the man you thought I was, Clara." The way he spoke her name, soft, almost reverent, sent a shiver through her. He hesitated, searching her face. "I'm not the monster in your father's letter." Clara's breath caught. She wanted to believe him. Part of her already did, but the wound of 8 long years still ached. Lucas looked at her for a long moment, his dark eyes full of things he wasn't ready to say. Then quietly, almost painfully, he added, "I never was." The firelight danced across his face, revealing shadows of old betrayals and new unspoken longing. Clara stood there, heart racing, caught between the anger she had carried for so long and the dangerous warmth beginning to bloom in its place. Outside, the night deepened. Inside Ravenscourt Manor, 2 wounded souls stood closer than society would ever allow, both terrified of what might happen if they took one more step. And somewhere in the darkness, the real truth was still waiting to be uncovered. The truth had been hiding in plain sight all along. Late one night, while the rest of Ravenscourt Manor slept, Clara sat alone at the long library table. A single lamp burned low beside her. Her fingers trembled as she turned over the final ledger page she had been avoiding for days. There it was. Not in Lucas's handwriting. Not in her father's careful script. Victor Langford's bold, slanted letters stared back at her clear, undeniable instructions to move funds through hidden accounts, followed by a cold note. Make certain Bennett takes the fall. Clara's breath caught sharply in her throat. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape. 8 years of pain. 8 years of believing Lucas Hawthorne had destroyed her family. All of it. Orchestrated by his own cousin. Tears burned behind her eyes. She wanted to scream. She wanted to burn every page in this cursed house. Instead, she sat frozen, the weight of the choice crushing her chest. If she stayed silent, she could keep her fragile position here. Ellie would remain safe with Lady Amelia. She could quietly leave when the work was done and never look back. But if she spoke, she would drag the entire Hawthorne name through the mud. A scandal this large could ruin Lucas forever. Clara closed the ledger slowly. Her hands would not stop shaking. The next afternoon, the family was summoned to the grand drawing room. Eleanor Hawthorne sat stiffly in her high-backed chair, her face pale but composed. Victor Langford stood near the fireplace, looking every inch the concerned relative. Colonel Thomas Blackwood and Lady Amelia Worthington had arrived earlier that morning at Clara's urgent request, their presence adding a quiet tension to the room. Lucas entered last. His face was drawn, eyes shadowed from sleepless nights. He had been fighting his own demons in silence, Clara knew. She had seen it in the way he stared into the fire when he thought no one was watching. Victor spoke first, his voice smooth as silk. I understand there have been troubling accusations flying about. Lucas, perhaps it's time we cleared the air for the sake of the family. Lucas's gaze moved to Clara. For one heartbeat, she saw the storm raging behind his eyes. Then he turned to Victor. No more lies. Lucas said, his voice low but cutting through the room like a blade. You were the one who took the money 8 years ago. You forged the transfers. You made certain my father's trusted bookkeeper, Clara's father, would be blamed. A heavy silence fell. Victor's smile faltered for the briefest second. Lucas, he said with a soft laugh, you're exhausted. These wild claims, I have the proof, Lucas interrupted. His hands clenched at his sides. And I will not protect you any longer. Eleanor Hawthorne rose slowly from her chair, one hand pressed to her chest. Lucas. What are you saying? Her voice cracked the pain of a mother hearing her world fracture raw in every word. Clara stepped forward. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced herself to stand tall. She looked at each face in the room, the dowager's disbelief, Victor's cold calculation, Colonel Blackwood's steady support, and Lady Amelia's quiet encouragement. Then she looked at Lucas. His eyes held hers, giving her strength she didn't know she needed. Clara took a deep breath, her voice trembling, yet clear. Victor Langford planned it all. He used my father as a scapegoat to cover his own greed. He nearly destroyed 2 families, and he would have succeeded if I hadn't come here. Her words hung in the air. Victor's face twisted. You dare accuse me, a Langford, on the word of a nobody? I dare. Clara replied, her voice gaining strength, even as tears stung her eyes, because the truth matters more than fear, more than titles, more than protecting a name built on lies. Colonel Blackwood stepped beside her, placing the folder of evidence on the table. Lady Amelia nodded, once her eyes shining with pride for her friend. Eleanor Hawthorne sank back into her chair, tears slipping silently down her cheeks as the weight of years of deception settled over her. The confrontation stretched on sharp words and broken silences filling the grand room. But in the end, the evidence was too clear, the witnesses too credible. Victor stood exposed, his mask finally shattered. When the room finally emptied, leaving only the crackle of the dying fire, Clara slipped away to the small sitting room off the east wing. She stood by the window, arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to hold together the pieces of her heart. The door opened softly behind her. Lucas entered. He closed the door with care, then crossed the room slowly, as though every step cost him something. Clara turned. The moment their eyes met, the careful walls she had built began to crumble. Lucas stopped just an arm's length away. The powerful Duke of Ravenscourt, the man feared and whispered about across London, looked at her with raw vulnerability. Then, without a word, he lowered himself to one knee before her. Clara's breath stopped. "Clara," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "I have spent years protecting a family that never protected me. I have carried silence like chains." He looked up at her eyes bright with unshed tears and something far deeper. "I will not ask you to forgive the past tonight, but I am begging you. Give me a chance to build something true with you. Not as a duke, not as a title, just as a man who has fallen in love with the only woman brave enough to make him want to be better." Clara stared down at him, her heart pounding so fiercely she could barely breathe. All the anger, all the fear, all the lonely years, they collided with this single breathtaking moment. She saw the man beneath the title wounded, proud, and desperately in love. And in that instant, Clara Bennett realized her own heart had already crossed every boundary of class and caution. She reached out with trembling fingers and touched his cheek. "Lucas." She breathed, her voice breaking with the depth of feeling she could no longer deny. The rain began to fall again outside, soft against the windows. Inside, two souls stood at the edge of everything they had ever known, terrified, hopeful, and finally undeniably connected. The breaking point had come, and neither of them would ever be the same again. Spring arrived gently at Ravenscourt Manor, softening the edges of old stone walls and breathing new life into the gardens. Victor Langford was gone. He had left England quietly under the cover of a grey dawn, stripped of any claim to the Hawthorne inheritance. There had been no public trial, no sensational headlines, only a private family settlement guided by Colonel Thomas Blackwood and Mr. Silas Grant. Lucas had chosen mercy over vengeance, but justice had still been served. The shadow that had haunted the family for 8 long years finally lifted. In the weeks that followed, Lucas stood before the gathered tenants and staff on the estate grounds. His voice carried clearly across the open field as he spoke of the wrongs done in his father's name and in his own silence. Clara Bennett's father was an honorable man, he said, his tone steady, yet filled with quiet regret. "Today I clear his name completely. Any debts or stains attached to it are mine to bear and erase." Clara stood a few steps behind him, her heart swelling as she watched the man she loved take responsibility with such humility. For the first time, the people of the estate looked at Lucas not with fear or distance, but with a fragile new respect. He didn't stop there. Lucas began making real changes: fairer wages for the farm workers, honest accounting practices, and open doors for those who had once been afraid to speak. The great house slowly felt less like a fortress and more like a home. Clara walked beside him through every step of that transformation. She was no longer simply the woman who had challenged him. She had become his equal partner, reviewing ledgers with him late into the evening, offering quiet but firm advice, and reminding him that true strength lay in compassion as much as in power. Their love grew in the small stolen moments between work and duty. A shared glance across the dining table, the way Lucas's fingers would brush hers when passing a document, the soft smiles that now came more easily to both of them. One quiet afternoon, Ellie Bennett arrived at the manor with Lady Amelia Worthington. The young girl's eyes sparkled with excitement as she ran into Clara's arms. "I'm going to study properly now," Ellie whispered, her voice full of wonder. "Lady Amelia says I can attend classes with her niece. I won't have to be afraid anymore." Clara held her sister tightly, tears slipping down her cheeks. The weight she had carried alone for so many years finally felt lighter. Even Eleanor Hawthorne began to change. The Dowager Duchess, once so rigid and distant, started inviting Clara to sit with her in the morning room. Their conversations were slow and careful, at first filled with hesitation and old pain, but gradually Eleanor's guarded heart softened. "You remind me of the girl I once was. Eleanor said one rainy afternoon, her voice trembling slightly, brave enough to speak when others stayed silent. She reached out and gently squeezed Clara's hand. "I was wrong about you, my dear. Welcome to this family. Not as an outsider, but as my daughter." Clara felt the last piece of her guarded heart unlock, and then came the day they had both been quietly dreaming of. On a bright spring morning in the small stone chapel nestled near the edge of the Hawthorne estate, Lucas Hawthorne and Clara Bennett were married. It was not a grand society affair with hundreds of guests and lavish displays. It was simple, intimate, and deeply personal. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting soft colors across the wooden pews. Ellie stood beside Clara, beaming with joy. Lady Amelia and Colonel Blackwood sat in the front row, their proud smiles warming the room. Mrs. Cora Whitaker, now visibly more at ease, had helped arrange the modest flowers. Lucas waited at the altar, tall and handsome in his dark coat, his eyes never leaving Clara as she walked toward him. When she reached him, he took her hands in his touch warm and sure. "I once believed I was destined to live in shadows," he whispered, so only she could hear. "You brought me into the light, Clara." She smiled through happy tears. "And you taught me that love is worth every risk." After the vows were spoken and the simple rings exchanged, they stepped outside into the golden afternoon. Under the blooming cherry trees near the chapel, Lucas pulled Clara gently into his arms. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Hawthorne?" he asked, his voice low and tender, a hint of playful warmth breaking through. Clara laughed softly, a sound full of wonder and release. They began to waltz slowly on the soft grass, no music but the gentle breeze and the distant song of birds. Lucas moved with careful grace, still healing from years of emotional weight, but his steps were sure because he held the woman he loved. Clara rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. In that moment she understood a truth deeper than any ledger or old letter could ever contain. Justice did not always arrive with thunder and revenge. Sometimes it came softly through courage that dared to speak the truth, and through the quiet, powerful choice to forgive. She had spent so many years protecting herself with suspicion and numbers and walls. Now in Lucas's arms under the warm spring sun, Clara finally let those walls fall completely. Happiness, she realized, had been waiting on the other side of letting go. As they turned slowly together, the light danced around them, bright golden and full of promise. Ravenscourt Manor stood behind them, no longer shadowed, but bathed in the same gentle sunlight. A new chapter had begun. One written not in fear or betrayal, but in honesty, forgiveness, and a love that had proven strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds. And as Clara looked up into Lucas's eyes that now held only warmth and devotion, she knew with quiet certainty, this was the light after shadow. This was home. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you. Aviso legal/disclaimer. These stories are crafted purely for entertainment and may contain imaginative additions or dramatic interpretations inspired by old frontier eras. We use AI-based resources, voice imagery and drafting as part of our creative process, but every final detail is carefully reviewed and shaped by human effort to preserve emotional depth and authenticity. We strictly follow YouTube's rules regarding AI-generated content and refrain from deepfakes, altered identities, or misleading representations. All images, sounds, and related materials are lawfully obtained. Please do not reuse, modify, or distribute any portion of this content without written permission. Thank you for valuing creativity, respect, and original work.